Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into America's political origins and evolving institutions. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. I can't tell you how pleasant that intro music sounds today to me. It is a pleasure to be back with everyone here at the Virtual Center. We were gone for a full week. It seemed like a month, to be honest with you, and I probably was a little bit too lazy during the week. I had all sorts of plans when I found out that we were going to be down for the week. I really thought, this is going to give me an opportunity to do this, that, and the other. I didn't do this and that. I frantically struggled yesterday to do a little bit of the other. But here we are on a Monday. Today is the second day of May in the year 2016. And to say that it is a pleasure to be back with you here live at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility would be an understatement to say the least. I missed you. I hope you missed the program. I missed the interaction. I missed the stimulation that I get from preparing for these programs. And it's unbelievable the psychology of preparing for a program like this where you're on live for a couple of hours each day. Even if it's not every day, it's 3 days a week. The stimulation, the degree to which the adrenaline flows is unbelievable. Because when it's not there, I noticed that my productivity dissipates to an immeasurable extent, and I mean that. The mind is willing, but all the things that are necessary to make it work don't work unless there is that adrenaline flowing, unless there is that pressure. And it keeps me going, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for an opportunity to be back on the air and to do these programs on the Virtual Center. It's been so long since we've been together that I'm not even going to make a stab trying to remember exactly where we were when last we got together. As I put on Facebook a note last Monday when I heard from Bob that Bob was a little bit under the weather last week, and we had to kind of forego the production of the program. Turns out that Bob was going to be gone for the week anyway, and had to cancel a trip because he was feeling a little bit under the weather. But he's at the top of his game now. I could tell just by the crispness of his voice, and as we chatted a few moments before we went on the air today. I would love to hear from you, if for nothing else, just to kind of reassure me that you're out there. We have a phone number that is dedicated to getting you, the listeners, on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And as we've said numerous times, 4676 translates on your keypad to HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to communicate directly with me in an email, I would love to hear from you. Again, I really would look forward to hearing from some of you again, and I'd love to get the emails. It makes getting up in the morning and sitting down with a cup of coffee and firing up the PC, and first thing I do is look at emails. And when there is one or more from our listeners, it just gets me up right away. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, that's lowercase, all one word, waobrien906@gmail.com. Also, I remind you of our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, if you are a regular user of Facebook, and you go to the home page, in the search box, If you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page. I also mentioned that I have also added a campaign page because, as many of you who have been listening know, I've entered the field of politics this year for the first time in my life, and I have a page on Facebook dedicated to the campaign that I'm presently engaged in. Here in West Virginia, we have our primaries next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow, May 10th. And as it turned out, I don't really have any competition in the primaries. It's not because there's nobody on the other side. It's because there are 2 slots available in the district in which I'm running. There are 2 candidates for the Democratic on the Democratic side of the ballot, and there are 2 incumbents on the Republican side of the ballot. So by definition, none of us will be eliminated May 10th as a result of the primary. And the way that this particular legislative district was created, which of course is gerrymandering in the extreme, there is also a requirement that one candidate must come from a particular county and another one must come from a particular county. So the fact of the matter is the election in this particular district reduces to me running against one particular incumbent and the other Democrat in the race running against the other Republican incumbent. So in a sense, that has really taken the pressure off as far as the primary is concerned. Although I've been going to Meet the Candidates events now for the last 5 or 6 weeks. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but in the local election, I've learned, and of course everybody told me this, but I didn't believe it, that when you go to these Meet the Candidate events, what you find out is that usually the place is filled with candidates. Probably 2 out of every 3 people there is running for something. And so the consequence of that is that you get to know the candidates pretty well on both sides of the aisle, very honestly. So I've been to a number of these. The next plate of spaghetti I have will not be any too soon. Let me tell you. But I've enjoyed it. I really have. I find it a little bit disconcerting as far as the home front is concerned. I find my wife and I we just kind of pass in the night, so to speak, as I'm heading off to a candidate event and she's trying to work a couple of jobs, and oftentimes we'll meet halfway between for a cup of coffee at a McDonald's or something and just chat for 15 minutes, and then she goes her way and I go mine. So it's been a little bit disruptive as far as our home life is concerned. But generally speaking, it's been an education for me. It's been one additional piece of my total education that I had been lacking. In my comments, and usually these Meet the Candidates events, especially here prior to the primary, merely give the candidate an opportunity to introduce himself or herself, because there are so many local candidates for a variety of local offices, be they county offices, municipal offices, statewide offices, judicial offices, etc. We have, for example, here in our local area, we have the state has added a 4th circuit to the circuit court system because the current 3 districts are so overwhelmed with cases. And there are 10 attorneys, local attorneys, running for that one slot in the 4th district, the new district, here in the county. And so when we go to a Meet the Candidate event, there are 10 candidates running for one office. And so when you add all the other offices to that, usually, well, I can give you an example. A week ago Saturday, I went to an event that began at 11 a.m. on Saturday and didn't end until 2:45 in the afternoon. So it went 3 hours and 45 minutes in order to give the candidates an opportunity to say a few words and introduce themselves. So you really don't have an opportunity to articulate particular positions on issues. So much as you're saying, this is me, here I am, I've been doing this, you may know my name from this, whatever. I promise that I'll do everything I can to bring honor to the district, to the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that really, it doesn't really give you a chance to stand out, as it were, from the crowd. But one of the things that the primary will do will be eliminate a lot of the candidates. And so once we begin to move towards the fall elections in November, early in November, I think it's the 4th, there'll be fewer candidates, which will mean that our opportunities to speak and to present will increase substantially, I expect, I hope. And I'm really looking forward to that, because it will give me an opportunity to elaborate and to really explain particular positions that I have on particular issues. And since I'm running against an incumbent, of course, I have a record to run against. To be specific, my opponent has a record to defend. And very, very honestly, I don't really believe that the particular record that I'm talking about, which is the record of a Republican-controlled legislature here in West Virginia, that has been in control for a couple of years. For years and years and years, the Democratic Party pretty much controlled West Virginia politics. And of course, if you look at the history, political history of West Virginia, what that meant was that coal pretty much controlled West Virginia politics. And so for a long time, as an emergent Republican opposition began to take shape in West Virginia, Republicans were, in many cases, not even strong enough to field candidates for many of the offices. It took a long time for the Republican Party here in West Virginia to build the kind of strength that was necessary to even field a slate of candidates. So in a sense, two-party politics in West Virginia for the last 100 years was pretty much non-existent. But a few years ago, it became quite existent, and the state became quite competitive. And West Virginia, along with a lot of other states, has experienced the takeover of the legislative process by the Republican Party. It's one of those states that has moved into the red column, so to speak. And that has pretty much been accompanied by an influx of out-of-state money, big money, from the Kochs and other groups that we know about. The American Legislative Exchange Council has sent in various pieces of draft legislation that the Republican legislature was committed to pass, and indeed they did pass. And so now the Republicans running, especially the incumbents running for office, have compiled a legislative record that they must defend. And it's against that record that I'm running. I'm not running against the candidate who happens to be my opponent. I'm running against the record of the party which he represents. And what makes that particularly easy to articulate, to clarify, is the fact that one of the characteristics of the Republican opposition, the Republican Party here in West Virginia, is the lockstep kind of voting that we see in the Republican Party in Washington. That in essence, the party has coalesced to the point that no member of the Republicans' majority in the Senate, for example, in Washington, seems to veer from the position. You'll recall the letter on President Obama's Iranian agreement, the letter that was drafted by Cotton from Texas, that was signed by 41, I think, Republican senators. And one wonders is it possible that 41 people from all different parts of the country would all agree on everything? And so what we begin to see, what we have to look for is the reason for that. And what we find that the reason for that is, as we would expect, is money, big money. And so what we see and what we've seen with the Citizens United decision is not just that big money has taken control of our political process, but the way it's taken control is not necessarily in a positive way, but in a negative way. As a result of the Tea Party movement, for example, Republicans without a track record, with no political history, came from nowhere and were able to gain victories in legislative and Senate seats, both at the national level and at the state level. And the only way that these people were able to win and to defeat incumbents was because of the big money that they had behind them. But there's another side to that. And that is, once these folks get elected, they're expected to vote a particular way. They're expected to vote according to script, according to the script that has been written. And the script that has been written is being written by the American Legislative Exchange Council. And they are expected to fall into line and vote the agenda that has been laid out for them. And if they don't, if they choose to veer and to go out on their own and to take a position in opposition to the party agenda, so to speak, then what we have seen happen in any number of races, both national races and statewide races, is that the money will pour into the state and back another candidate. Once you step out of line, your political career is, for all practical purposes, over. Because you are there to vote as you are being told to vote. And if you don't, then you will be replaced by somebody who will agree in exchange for the kind of money needed to win a campaign, to vote according to the party line. It violates everything that I stand for. It violates everything that I believe morally, intellectually, ethically about our political system. I think that one of the things that's become clear in the better than 3 years that we've been doing these programs here at the Virtual Center, one of the things that's become very clear, I hope, is that as we've gone through and looked at many of the Federalist Papers and looked at the writings of Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson and Washington and the others, I've become a fan of the Constitution. I always was. But I think I'm probably more in appreciation, and I have greater respect for what these people were able to do and how well and how they were able to do it than I ever had before we began these programs. And so this disease, if you will, that seems to have afflicted our election process, and I believe directly threatens the future of this republic, is more than anything else what caused me to make the decision that if I was ever going to try to do something, this was the time to do it. And so that's really what I've been involved in for a good portion of the week that we weren't having our programs here at the Virtual Center. But we are back now, and I am so grateful for it. You know, it was interesting, the comments that I've just made over the last 10 or 15 minutes, I hadn't necessarily planned to make them. That what I had planned to do was to make reference to a posting that I put on our Facebook page 2 days ago. And the irony is, it spoke pretty particularly to the West Virginia political situation. But the fact of the matter is, it's almost a carbon copy of the comments that I've just made over the last 10 to 15 minutes. And so the irony is, I've kind of thrown out a scheme here, or a theme, and now I'd like to at least introduce you or acquaint you, if you haven't had the opportunity to look at our Facebook page, to an example of exactly how that's working here in the state of West Virginia. And I think for most of the listeners to this program, regular listeners, are not local, are not in West Virginia, but it's become possible in many, many cases, in many situations, to use the local political situation here as an illustration of a principle that really becomes much bigger, much broader than just the local state. So let me give you an example, a local example here in West Virginia, of the points and the issues that I hope I have successfully raised in the first 15 to 20 minutes of our time back together again here at the Virtual Center. Just the other day, 2 or 3 days ago here in West Virginia, I believe Friday, could have been Saturday, there was an article in the Charleston Gazette, the West Virginia, statewide West Virginia newspaper. And this was an article written by a law professor at West Virginia University. And the author of this particular op-ed piece, whose last name, as I recall, was Peck, Dr. Peck, who's a professor in the law school, made the point that she and 14 other professors at the West Virginia School of Law, all of them in full agreement about President Obama's right, constitutional right, to appoint a Supreme Court justice to replace the deceased Antonin Scalia. And all 15 of these law professors at West Virginia University believe that the Constitution mandates that the president's job is to nominate, the Senate's job is to give advice and consent. But nowhere in the Constitution, as these professors read it, is the right of the Senate to not participate in the process, to refuse to participate in the process of filling a vacancy on the Supreme Court. And so all 15 of these law professors at West Virginia University signed a letter to the state's Republican Senator, Capito, Senator Sheila Capito, and encouraged her to do everything she could to move the Senate into acting positively on the process, not necessarily encouraging the approval for the Supreme Court of the president's nominee, but to move the process forward so there could at least be a hearing. And according to this op-ed piece, Senator Capito respectfully declined the invitation and said that she indeed was going to, along with her colleagues, was going to wait out the last 7 months of the Obama presidency so that the people in the fall elections this fall could participate actively in the process of filling the Supreme Court vacancy. That's the scenario that I wrote this piece on about Facebook. And of course, what I said is that one has to wonder how a United States senator could respectfully decline this advice, especially coming from the fact, because of the fact that it comes from the law school at West Virginia University, which is the state's premier law school. And as the ratings of all the nation's law schools goes, West Virginia's School of Law might not be the number one school in the nation, but it's respected as one of the best. And so the fact of the matter is, where would a United States senator in West Virginia go in order to find evidence, supporting evidence, to counter the requests of 15 faculty members at the law school? So the fact of the matter is, what this seemed to say to me is that Sheila Moore Capito, our Republican senator, chose not to refute the position of these law professors, but to just deny their request respectfully. And I raised the question about the word respectfully. And I said in my posting, given the lack of a legitimate stand on which to decline evidence that's so overwhelming, and if you read the letter from these law professors, they quote Alexander Hamilton's positions on the court in the Federalist Papers to a T. In fact, my comment was that Alexander Hamilton was at his very best in this letter. Consequently, it seems to me that it might be appropriate to qualify the use of the word respectfully. Because what Senator Capito has done is not present any countervailing evidence to deny the case, to refute the case being made in favor of President Obama's constitutional right, but rather a blatant out-and-out decision to deny what they're saying without giving any reason other than, I'm the senator and I chose not to go along with your request. So therefore, Senator Capito's use of the term respectfully in her responding letter to these professors, I would suggest to you, raises serious questions about how respectful that letter really is. And this gets into some of the issues that I raised over the last 10 to 15 minutes in today's program. Besides the obvious fact that there's little hard evidence to be brought to this argument that would counter the power of the argument itself, the reason that I'm writing this particular posting on Facebook is because there's something here that seems to pack an even greater punch than the out-and-out denial involved. Namely, the pressure that Senator Capito seems to be under that would cause her to stick with the script and never veer from the agenda of the United States Senate leadership. Republican leadership, which of course is Mitch McConnell as the president of the Senate. And then I've taken that fact and reduced it into the local political situation here in West Virginia. And this is what I've said. We here in West Virginia are in the midst of primaries to choose a president, several United States senators, the entire House of Representatives for the whole nation, and untold numbers of state and local officers and representatives. In almost every case, the operative assumption behind the idea of free elections is that the people speak and those they elect respond. They don't always have to agree with the people's will when there is one. But there's nothing anywhere else in this description of how a republic is supposed to work that suggests a power greater than the people when the people speak. In other words, in theory, our whole republic is based on the idea if citizens are going to go and make the effort to vote, to express their opinion on issues and candidates, then the candidates that they elect have a responsibility to respond to what the people have said. They don't necessarily have to concede or give in to the will of the people when there is a will. But there's nothing in the process that I know about that suggests that there's a voice greater, an issue greater than the voice of the people when the people choose to speak. What we are seeing in our 21st century political world, I've said, is that clearly there's another power that's greater than all of this. The power that really controls what elected officials do and say. Money. Anybody believe for a minute that Senator Capito would stand a chance next time around if she decided to back President Obama on this Supreme Court issue? And then I've gone back into a little local history here in West Virginia. And the question that I asked is a very specific one. Anyone remember from a few elections ago the phrase, "Who is Brent Benjamin?" Brent Benjamin, in the last state Supreme Court election that we had here in West Virginia, was elected to the Supreme Court. He came out of nowhere to win election to the West Virginia Supreme Court. And the campaign slogan that everybody remembers from that campaign was the slogan, who is Brent Benjamin? Because nobody ever heard of him. Yet he won. And the reason he won is because he had the power and the backing of big money. And so what I said is, remember the slogan, "Who's Brent Benjamin?" We found out, didn't we? John Grisham, in one of his novels, included Brent Benjamin's bought elections in one of his novels. It became a scandal here in West Virginia because Grisham, in one of his best-selling novels, told the story of a West Virginia coal baron contributing $3 million to the election campaign of an unknown judge, of an unknown attorney, named Brent Benjamin, who was elected to the West Virginia Supreme Court. That coal baron was Don Blankenship. At the time, Don Blankenship was CEO of Massey Energy. And many of you will recall that it was the Massey mine that exploded, killing 29 West Virginia miners. You'll also recall that within the last several months, Blankenship was brought up on trial for violating safety regulations and thereby helping to cause the death of these 21 miners. And the jury found him guilty in that case. And right now, Don Blankenship is looking towards serving a 1-year sentence in federal prison, which is to begin this month, the month of May, for that violation. So that's who Brent Benjamin is. Those who, the point that I made, those who read Grisham thought that it was only fiction. We here in West Virginia know better. Fast forward to this year, to 2016. Brent Benjamin is back on the ballot here in West Virginia. But this time, he's not getting the backing of the big spenders. This time, there's a female attorney named Beth Walker who is rolling in dough, as it were, as the big money is backing her candidacy. Not only that, but close to $1 million in this money has gone into negative campaigning against 2 of the candidates for this Supreme Court seat. Former Attorney General Darrell McGraw and former Democratic Senate member Bill Wooten, who's an attorney, local attorney here in Beckley, West Virginia, in southern West Virginia. And the irony of ironies is that all of this is happening in a state which has just adopted legislation to make court elections nonpartisan. This was a key agenda item of the new Republican legislative majority here in West Virginia. The Republicans were insistent that our judicial elections be nonpartisan. And the legislation passed. The governor signed it. And indeed, for the first time, West Virginia's judicial elections are nonpartisan. But the fact of the matter is, if you follow the money, it seems to make no difference at all, that we have nonpartisan judicial elections. Because close to $1 million has gone into negative campaign ads against 2 of the candidates for this seat on the Supreme Court. And tens of thousands of dollars has been made available to Beth Walker for her campaign for that same seat. So one has to wonder, What happened to Brent Benjamin? He's on the ballot. He's running for re-election. He's the incumbent. Where's the backing that he had in the last election? Of course, he doesn't have Blankenship anymore because Blankenship is just about ready to go to prison. But apparently, and of course we don't know the details, but apparently the big spenders have decided that they would rather have Beth Walker carrying their water, so to speak, than another round with Brent Benjamin. So lo and behold, we have the unique situation here where Brent Benjamin has been one of the outspoken opponents of this big money in our judicial election. No wonder it's not going to him. When it was going to him. So the question is, what's going on? It seems the answer is that partisan, nonpartisan makes no difference. When it comes to spending this kind of money, those who make the decisions to spend decide where it's going, who it's going to support, and who it's going to attack. It's a classic example of the larger principle that we talked about just 15, 20 minutes ago. It's a local example of something that is not just local, of a principle or a phenomenon that is not just local. And the reason, and I'm not necessarily taking issue with these people, they are political candidates. When they filed and they decided to run for office, they basically rendered themselves vulnerable to this kind of commentary. So I don't feel that I'm violating any political or ethical issues at all. In fact, in a conversation, an on-air conversation like this, it seems to me that the issue is not the personalities involved. The issue here in a program like the Virtual Center is the impact that this threatens to have on the republic, on the citizens and voters in this republic. Because there's absolutely no question that the basic principles on which this republic was founded is based on the idea that the interaction and the reciprocal back and forth between voters and elected representatives is the key ingredient to the very existence of Republican government here in America. You'll remember James Madison said that the genius of the American people is directly linked to the principle of republicanism. In fact, Madison made the point in one of the Federalist Papers that if it could be proven that the Constitution of the United States was anti-Republican, did not conform and strengthen the principles of Republican government, then the Constitution ought not to be ratified. Madison said that. He is the author of the Constitution as it was originally introduced in Philadelphia in May of 1787. And for him to say, if evidence can be brought forward that this Constitution violates the principles of Republican government, then I will go along with those who believe that the Constitution ought not to be ratified. Because, Madison said, the genius of the American people is linked directly to republicanism. The American people, the history of the American people's experience through the colonial period, through the Revolution, and into the years following independence, the experience and the priorities of the American people are linked to the idea, to the principles of republicanism. And Madison made very clear that what distinguishes Republican government is the reciprocal relationship between people and their elected representatives. Specifically, the right of all the people, not just a few, but all the people, to participate actively in the political process. The implication is that participation ought not to be meaningless. That by definition, those elected to represent, to articulate the voice of the people, have a responsibility to respond to the people. They don't necessarily have to go along with the will of the people when there is a will. That's pure democracy. That's majority rule. Madison said that's not what we've got. We've got a republic. And Madison, in Federalist Number 10, went to great lengths to distinguish between a democracy and a republic. But clearly, the distinguishing feature of a republic is the people's right to participate in the process, in the political process. And by implication, government's responsibility is to respond. That clearly Madison, Hamilton, all the founders accepted as the basic principle of Republican government. The voice of the people in a popular government is the priority voice. When the people choose to express it, they have a right to demand a response. On the national level, in the Supreme Court situation, Mitch McConnell and the Republican majority in the Senate have decided to not respond. That's what the law professors at West Virginia University were appealing to our Republican Senator, Sheila Moore Capito, to do something about. She declined to do it. Basically, in declining to do it, she was basically saying something even more important than declining. And that is that there is a greater voice that I must respond to than the Constitution of the United States, than the voice of the people of the United States. The people ratified the Constitution. The Constitution defined a process for filling Supreme Court vacancies. And the Senate majority has chosen to ignore the Constitution of the United States, which means ignore the expressed voice of the people of the United States. In doing that, what Sheila Moore Capito is saying is that there is a louder voice. There is a voice that has more power and more influence than the Constitution or than the people who ratified that Constitution. It's money. It's the threat of pouring huge amounts of money into the next campaign against me if I don't go along. I would suggest to you that that threatens the very nature of the republic. You can make as many arguments to the contrary as you want, but there's no way that I could accept the fact that that principle, this reality, this story, does not belong here at the Virtual Center. This is what this program is about. This is what the Head On Radio Network itself is about. Is to keep the people informed as to the strength and health of the republic. And I believe that's exactly what we're doing. Because I think we've got a situation locally here which mirrors a situation nationally, which suggests something bigger than the Constitution, bigger than the voice of the people. It's the power and influence of money. It's the ability of big money to literally control the process. It's the power and influence of that money that literally goes to the point of rendering the voice of the people mute, meaningless, vulnerable, and susceptible to being ignored. If the Citizens United decision is responsible for this kind of influence in the political process of money and those who bring it, then Citizens United is a stain on the character and the behavior of the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a stain on the conservative majority who supported it. It directly refutes the protestations of the majority, and the person I'm thinking of specifically is Justice Kennedy, who denied that there was evidence that money influenced politics in this country. Senator Sanders has made a campaign issue out of the Supreme Court, filling the Supreme Court vacancy issue. He has made it his point to stress that if he's the nominee, if he becomes president of the United States, a Supreme Court nominee must disavow the Citizens United decision. You can call that political tampering with the independence of the court, but I would suggest to you, in making a decision like this, the court did more to destroy its own independence, its political independence, than anything Bernie Sanders or any other candidate might do. As long as that decision stands, it constitutes a stain on the record and the performance of the members of the Supreme Court who supported it. And it has to go. But the reality is, as we know, it can take some time for that to happen. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not all that sure how much time we've got. When you look at the impending possibilities of a Fifth Amendment Convention being called to amend the Constitution of the United States. The clock is ticking loudly for the Republic. And I'm quite nervous about it, which is the reason that I wanted to use our first program back after being gone for a week with this issue, because it's that important, I do believe. I trust that you will agree. If you don't, then please let us hear from you. If you do, let us hear from you. We've reached the top of the hour. It's 59 minutes after the hour, so we finished our first hour back after a week's hiatus, and we're going to pause and take a 5-minute break as we usually do, and then we'll return for our second hour here at the Virtual Center. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on the Head On Radio Network. We're going to take a short break, a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us.
Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour here on this Monday, the second day of May in the year 2016. We have a full hour ahead of us. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is our first live broadcast after a week-long hiatus, and it is a pleasure to be back with you. I would love to hear from you. I took the opportunity in our first hour to make what I think is a pretty strong plea for defense of the Republic against the influence of big money. I'm talking about something here that is so pervasive, it's everywhere. I don't pretend to expect in any way that what I say ought to be definitive on this issue. So many people are talking about it in so many different ways. Thomas Edsall, for example, in the New York Times, has made a regular point in his op-ed pieces over the last, better than the last couple of years, to document, to provide the kinds of evidence which suggest that America is on the cusp of experiencing plutocracy in this country. And again, if you were to look up the meaning of plutocracy, what you're basically talking about is the confluence of power, of political power and money, the ability of big money to buy political power. In theory, the debate in this republic has always been the ability of the people, the ability of the political apparatus to somehow regulate and control the influence of money in what we do as a society and how we do it, and most importantly, who benefits from it and who doesn't. But when political power and economic power fall into the same hands, you have a problem. Everybody's talking about it. It's talked about in a number of different venues. Those who pull together economic data to point out the reality and the existence and the influence of the so-called 1%, or even more dramatic, the 1/10 of 1%, that seems to have controlled most of the profit since the recovery after the last recession has happened. There's absolutely no question. There's documented evidence everywhere to validate the fact that the degree of inequality in our society is unprecedented. The gap between those who have and those who have not has never been wider. Consequently, the threat to the very nature, the very fabric of the republic is in jeopardy. I think we're going to see that as we move into some of the programs, some of the issues that I think we'll be dealing with in the next 2 or 3 programs here at the Virtual Center. I would love to hear from you on this one. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, HORN. If you'd like to respond in an email, then I invite you to send that email directly to me at waobrien906 at gmail.com. W.A. O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N 906, all one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. And if you choose to do so, then I invite you to visit our Facebook page for the Virtual Center. If you go to the homepage of Facebook and you go to the search box at the top and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And if you look down on that, you will find that one of the most recent entries on there is the document that we referred to in our first hour about the letter of the 15 law professors at West Virginia University to West Virginia Republican Senator Sheila Moore Capito, urging her to follow the Constitution and support a hearing for President Obama's nominee to fill the vacancy created by the death of Antonin Scalia. There's an opportunity to respond to that Facebook entry on Facebook. You can respond to me directly on Facebook. You can respond by by sending me an email at waobrien906 at gmail.com, or you can respond by calling our phone number at area code 304-663-4676. I just hope that you will take some of these issues to heart, that you will think about them, and that you reach the decision that this is something that you feel is worth your time and would benefit all the people listening in, all the people that we can reach here on the Head On Radio Network through the Virtual Center program. So with that, I'd like to move into something a little bit different. On the other hand, in some ways, it's not that different, but it's a little bit different, at least in the introductory portion, because it deals with our current presidential campaign, the primary system that we currently find ourselves in. Most specifically, it deals with the primary campaign of Bernie Sanders. And of course, I'm aware, as many of you are, that the media has chosen to pretty much drive the final nail into the Sanders candidacy by suggesting, and even Senator Sanders himself acknowledges, that while there is still an opportunity to secure the nomination of the Democratic Party and overcome Hillary Clinton in this process, it is a very narrow opportunity, and the chances of being successful in doing it have become pretty extreme, pretty remote. And in fact, Senator Sanders himself has acknowledged I apologize for the phone ringing. Senator Sanders himself has acknowledged that not that his campaign is over. He has promised that he will continue to campaign right through the convention. But even he has said that accumulating as many delegates as possible will be important, not necessarily to win him the nomination, so much as to have a meaningful impact on the party platform, which will be adopted at the July convention of the Democratic Party. And his insistence that that platform be as progressive as possible. And of course, Hillary Clinton has shifted gears in the campaign as well. And she has acknowledged and admitted and her support for the idea that that campaign platform be progressive as well. So, of course, the clear issue between the two is that the progressivism as exists in the mind of Bernie Sanders is a little bit different than the progressivism that exists in the mind of Hillary Clinton. But it is progressive nonetheless. I think the issue here is degree. And there's no question that Secretary Clinton is doing everything she can do to appeal to those who have supported Bernie Sanders in this campaign, and to try, because she's got to, given the millions of supporters who have come forward to support Senator Sanders. It's clear that Hillary Clinton's success in the election, whoever the Republican nominee might be, it's obviously beginning to look like it'll be Donald Trump, but her success is pretty much dependent on winning over a significant number of those who supported Bernie Sanders. So the ability of the nominee to bring the party together is pretty much critical here. And so that's kind of where we are. And of course, we're right on the cusp, because tomorrow is the Indiana primary. On the Republican side, it's beginning to look like Donald Trump. He says that if he wins big in Indiana, as he's projected, right now the polls are showing Trump with a 15 percentage point lead over Ted Cruz. If he wins by anything like that amount, then his argument is that the campaign, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, is pretty much over. And of course, then the issue is going to revolve specifically around the 1237, the number of delegates he needs to lock the nomination in before the convention meets in early July. On the Republican side, the polls are showing that Sanders and Secretary Clinton are close enough that it could be a race. I think the last I saw, Secretary Clinton was leading in the polls by 4 percentage points, which is within which is in the so-called range of error, so to speak. So Bernie Sanders is making a big push in Indiana. And in fact, what I heard today, I think he had 3 different appearances in Indiana. I might point out that many of you may know that Senator Sanders was here in West Virginia this past weekend. He had a rally here on Friday night, I believe, in Huntington, West Virginia, and drew more than 6,000 people to hear him. Also, Secretary Clinton and former President Bill Clinton have been here in West Virginia, and that's created quite a stir, because Senator Clinton's position on coal has pretty much irritated a lot of the coal interests here in West Virginia. In fact, there was the semblance of a boycott of Bill Clinton in one of our former coal counties, Logan County here, over the weekend. But while he met opposition in Logan County when he appeared at the state capitol in Charleston, he obviously got a rousing welcome. So the campaign is pretty much very close to us here in West Virginia as we speak. That's really the issue that I'd like to address, and I'm pretty well convinced that we're not going to be able to do justice to this in our entire, in the time we have left in today's program. So chances are we'll probably extend the conversation that I'd like to begin now into tomorrow's program as well. And while I mention that, let me remind you that, because it's been a while since we've been together, that on Tuesdays our program begins 1/2 hour later than it does on Mondays and Wednesdays. So tomorrow's program will begin at 1:30 Eastern Daylight Time rather than 1 p.m. And many of you who have listened to the Virtual Center on the regular basis already know that. but I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow's program will begin 30 minutes later than we began today's program, or then we'll begin Wednesday's program as well. With that, I'd like to get into an issue. It's directly pertinent to Bernie Sanders, to the Sanders campaign. It begins with an article that appeared over this past weekend here in West Virginia in the Charleston Gazette, in the Charleston newspapers, the Daily Mail. And let me just, for purposes of clarification, let me point out to you that for a long time, West Virginia was blessed, as were many other cities and states, with more than one newspaper. And for several years, all the years that I've been in West Virginia, the daily paper, the morning paper, was the Charleston Gazette. It was considered to be the liberal paper. The evening paper, the Daily Mail, was considered to be the conservative voice. And of course, the idea of having both of these in the same city, in the same state, was based on the idea of putting both positions or both perspectives out there for public consumption. The idea being that you would have a better educated citizenry if it was exposed to both sides of the political spectrum, so to speak. And of course, as we know, the cost of production, as well as the rise of the internet and Facebook and all the rest of it, has caused the closing of, and the combining of many of our major newspapers, to the point that many cities have lost the opportunity to support two papers, and they have become one. Here in West Virginia, the two papers, which were traditionally separate, even though they were published in the same facility, have merged. And now the paper is called the Charleston Gazette and Daily Mail. And it incorporates both perspectives within the same publication, within the same paper. And the Sunday paper is a mixture of the two. The Sunday Gazette and the Sunday Gazette Mail is the official name of the Sunday paper. So here in West Virginia, the point of all of that is that if you read a particular op-ed piece that appeared in the Gazette, you could presume that the direction of that article was toward the left. Whereas if the op-ed piece in question appeared in the Daily Mail, you could presume that the perspective was right of center, was conservative. And so, for example, the Gazette would reach out to national commentators and present them. For example, the Gazette would regularly contain articles by, for example, Eugene Robinson from the Washington Post and others. Fareed Zakaria, for example, who's on CNN, would frequently be posted as an op-ed piece in the Gazette. On the other hand, on the Daily Mail, on the conservative side, frequently there would be articles by noted conservative right, Charles Krauthammer, for example, and a number of others. One of the regular commentators on the conservative side here in West Virginia, the Daily Mail side, is a local personality here in West Virginia whose name is Hoppy Kercheval. His last name is Kercheval, Kerchival. First name Hoppy. Hoppy Kercheval is an institution here in West Virginia. And for the most part, the reason for that is that Hoppy does a 2-hour live talk program 5 days a week here in West Virginia that is broadcast statewide. It's well known and heavily listened to throughout the state. Hoppy's an institution here in West Virginia. He's obviously been a big supporter of West Virginia University athletics. He's become a very reputable and respected voice here in West Virginia. His program appears from 10 a.m. to noon, 5 days a week. His program is entitled Talkline. The reason I mention that is because I, too, have come to respect and to value Hoppy Kercheval here in West Virginia. For one thing, his program is broadcast throughout the state. For another thing, cost has prohibited many local programs and local talk shows to the point that the only voice that West Virginians have is to call into Hoppy Kercheval. The only way that West Virginians can be heard statewide is to be a caller on Hoppy Kercheval's program. Now, this doesn't mean that Hoppy Kercheval is neutral or is not liberal or not conservative. Because the fact of the matter is, for many months and maybe years, I'm not sure, Hoppy has written columns that appear regularly in the conservative newspaper out of Charleston, the Daily Mail. I've seen a number of pieces that he's written of late. He's a regular contributor to the Daily Mail, which means that much of what he writes tends to fall on the right side of midpoint in the political agenda. I've come to accept that. It doesn't bother me that he comes down on that side, or it wouldn't bother me if he came down on the other side. Because the presumption is that his role in West Virginia as a spokesman, as a vehicle, as a medium for the people, the citizens of West Virginia to be heard, is critical. This weekend, Hoppy Kercheval wrote a piece for the Daily Mail on Bernie Sanders. I was struck by the title. I was more than interested to see what Hoppy Kercheval would say about Bernie Sanders, especially now since the campaign, the primary against Secretary Clinton, is pretty much into the home stretch. So I was particularly interested in reading what Hoppy Kercheval had to say. The fact that this is an issue here at the Virtual Center, the fact that this column, written this past Friday by Hoppy Kercheval on the Sanders campaign, is something that I felt that it be necessary to feature here on the Virtual Center, I think is significant. Let me explain why. I have felt for a long time a certain affinity to Hoppy Kercheval. Not because of political ideology, but because I, too, had the opportunity some years ago to host a daily talk show on terrestrial radio here in West Virginia. I had a daily program from 3 to 5 p.m. here on a local Beckley radio station for close to 6 years. at the beginning of this century, from 2000 until October of 2005. I think my last program was the 5th of October in the year 2005. And I'll be honest with you, one of the things that I remember most fondly about that program is that that's where I had the opportunity to meet and become so fond of Bob Kincaid. Because at that time, Bob had a program on the same network, the same station, in the evening. And there were a couple of times where I had asked Bob to fill in for me in the afternoon because I had some sort of a conflict, schedule conflict or whatever. So Bob and I became pretty close because we both worked at the same station. And in the morning, another local personage, Steve O'Brien, used to host a program from 9 in the morning, I believe, until noon. Maybe it was 10, I can't remember specifically. Steve was a conservative and made no bones about it. Bob was obviously progressive in the evening, made no bones about it. I was the one in the middle of the afternoon, and many of those who listened believed that I fell somewhere in the middle between these two extremes. I don't know that I really did, but I think people assumed because I was in the middle in the daytime schedule that I fell in the middle ideologically as well as chronologically. But be that as it may, in the 5+ years that I did that program, and of course now I've been doing the Virtual Center here on the Head On Radio Network for better than 3 years, I developed a certain sense of responsibility to the program and to the people who listen to the program. I'm not arrogant enough or facetious enough to argue that everything I believe about my role as a host of a program like this or a program like that one on terrestrial radio ought to be considered definitive. But the fact of the matter is, I believed that my position as host of a call-in program like that presented to me certain ethical responsibilities. I believed that I had a responsibility to be fair. I can remember numerous callers that would call in on that program and engage me about the issue of objectivity. And they would argue that my role, my responsibility was to be objective, was to present both sides of the issue so that people could make up their own mind. And that I was not to have a particular position on these issues myself. My job was to present the evidence on either side and leave the job of forming conclusions to the listeners. Theoretically, I was not to have one. And I can remember engaging listeners on numerous occasions about this issue of objectivity versus the issue of fairness. And I can remember particularly saying on more than one occasion that when we're talking about war, or we're talking about poverty, or we're talking about hunger, or we're talking about crime and violence, we're talking about abuse, domestic abuse, spousal abuse, whatever it might be, in order to be objective on issues like that, you would have to be dead. To not have a feeling or a sense of right and wrong in these issues. However, I did feel that I had a responsibility to be fair. There were certain rules of the road, certain rules of engagement that I felt academically and intellectually and ethically that I was obligated to follow. I didn't necessarily believe that one of the objectives that I was committed to pursue was that of objectivity. I denied that. But I felt that I had an obligation to be fair. And what that meant was I had an obligation to respect content, to respect information, to respect evidence. And that I also had an obligation to be able to distinguish between evidence and opinion. And I felt that my academic background qualified me to do that. And on numerous occasions, I would take issue with callers. And I would say, basically, you're asking me to support your opinion, and I can't do that. I will respect the evidence that you bring to the table, because the only way that I can deny evidence, provided it's evidence, is to find alternative evidence that refutes it. But if it's evidence, then I must respect it. And if there's some sort of change that the existence of that evidence requires, it must be me that changes my position, because the nature of evidence is that it is irrefutable. It is evidence. It is fact. That James Madison said the following quote, or wrote the following quote, is evidence. What his intent was is interpretation. I can quibble, I can disagree with the way people interpret a particular statement, but I can't change the wording in the statement. I can't change the evidence. I believe that my role as host on a talk show required that I be fair and responsible, not that I be objective. Where am I going here? I have long presumed, and still presume, that talk show hosts carry the same responsibility. That's why I have such concerns about the Michael Savages and Rush Limbaughs of the world. Because they make no pretense, they make no issue at all over manipulation of evidence. They are entertainers. They believe, in fact, they say that their job is to entertain. That means that if they have to manipulate evidence in order to be entertaining, they are comfortable doing that. I'm not, and I take very strong issue with that. Because I believe not that they can't have opinions, that they can't have interpretations, but there are certain limitations to those interpretations. They need to be based on evidence. If the evidence doesn't support the interpretation, then it's the interpretation that needs to be changed, not the evidence. You can't change the evidence. But they do. And they do it regularly. They misquote. They manufacture letters that don't even exist. They manufacture quotes to fit a particular agenda. I find that irresponsible. I find it dangerous. And I find it especially disturbing because so many of our citizens, especially our young people, do not have the quality, the kind of education that equips them to be able to handle that kind of manipulation, that kind of ideological manipulation. It's brainwashing. I believe that a person who has the responsibility of conducting conversation and helping to inform the citizens of this country on the issues of the day has a responsibility to the evidence. I believe that all of us have a responsibility to be fair. Consequently, when I read Hoppy Kercheval's piece on Bernie Sanders, I was not surprised that it was critical of Senator Sanders. I expected that. It appeared in the Daily Mail. By definition, it's going to be somewhat critical of Bernie Sanders. That didn't bother me. What bothered me was that I assumed, given the source, given that it was written by Hoppy Kercheval, that it would be fair, that it would be responsible. And I was disappointed. I am disappointed. It may not be fair of me to impose the same kinds of responsibility requirements on Hoppy Kercheval that I place on myself. But I do that. Again, maybe I don't have the right to do that, but I do that. And if Hoppy Kercheval was here, he might say, I have no responsibility to do that. This is a free country, and I have the right to write an op-ed piece and put in it what I want. And he may be right, but I won't agree with him. Because my feeling is, if he puts an op-ed piece in a reputable publication like the Daily Mail, he has a responsibility to be true to the evidence. He does not have the right to manipulate evidence. His interpretation of that evidence is his business. But the evidence itself is sacrosanct. And what that means is, if you're being critical of Bernie Sanders because of particular positions that he's taking in his presidential campaign, it's one thing to be opposed to those issues. It's quite another to misstate them, or to misinterpret them, or to intentionally misdefine them, and then criticize the candidate for a position that the candidate is not or never did take. Let me be specific. Hoppy's piece begins with a very human, personal, and I thought creditable position on Bernie Sanders. He opens by saying the following: I confess, there's a small part of me that finds Bernie Sanders appealing. No doubt that will confirm the suspicions of readers and listeners who believe I'm a closet liberal and sound patronizing to progressives who feel the burn to their very core. In this first few sentences, Kercheval does what I think are important things. First of all, he links the readers of this article with his listeners, which suggests to me that he feels the same responsibility in this article that he does when he's on the air. That's important to me, because that, in my mind, confirmed that he's as aware as I am of the responsibilities he carries as a host of a statewide talk show. The fact that he mentions that this might confirm in the minds of some that he's really a closet liberal because he's saying good things about Bernie Sanders, suggests that he's going to argue or present evidence to indicate that he's not a closet liberal at all. But that's neither here nor there. The fact that he opened with what I thought was a cordial, very kind acknowledgement that there are things about Bernie Sanders that he finds appealing and that he's willing to acknowledge that up front, suggests that he himself recognizes the responsibility to be fair. And to say that while there are things that he says that I don't agree with, on the other hand, I respect his sincerity, I respect his passion, I respect his commitment. And indeed he says that. In the very next sentence, he says, let me explain. It is evident that Sanders is sincere, a true believer in how the government should be enlarged and empowered, even more, to further file down the edges of capitalism while spreading around the wealth. Period. That sentence was the first red flag in this article that really got my attention. Because in the same sentence, he acknowledges that Bernie Sanders is sincere. But he ends it by alleging that Bernie Sanders is doing things and saying things which I know to not be true. Namely, to further file down the edges of capitalism while spreading around the wealth. To further file down the edges of capitalism. The implication here is that Bernie Sanders is anti-capitalist. That Bernie Sanders is committed to eliminating or weakening or destroying capitalism as an economic system. Immediately when I read that sentence, I thought to myself, if that was true, Bernie wouldn't be talking about breaking up banks. He'd be talking about government taking them over. He wouldn't be talking about privatizing things. He'd be talking about making them state-controlled, as it were. So immediately, I had some doubts about whether, in fact, Bernie Sanders was really involved in filing down the edges of capitalism. Spreading around the wealth is clearly a pejorative statement. The implication of that is socialism. The desire to make sure that everybody has the same amount. And the only way to do it is to take away people's freedom to have more. I would argue that that's not Bernie Sanders at all, but that's neither here nor there. I'd like to get to that at some future point, because I think that's an issue in itself. And then Kercheval goes into the particular positions that Bernie Sanders has taken in the campaign. He writes the following. Bernie says, with great conviction, that college tuition should be free. We would be better off with a Medicare for all healthcare system. and family leave with pay. We should stop using fossil fuels. The system is rigged against you, and that Americans will be willing to pay more taxes, or businesses will be forced to pay more taxes for his proposals. Those are indeed some of the campaign positions that Bernie Sanders takes. He is indeed an advocate for a Medicare for all healthcare system, a universal healthcare system where there aren't any insurance companies or health insurance involved at all. You would basically adopt the system that exists in Canada or Great Britain, where as a citizen, you would be entitled to health care. You would go to the doctor, the bill would be sent to the government or to an agency of the government and paid, and that would be it. That's true. He's also an advocate of stopping fossil fuels. He's a big supporter of taking steps to combat climate change. That's true. He indeed does say that the system is rigged in favor of certain people against the rest of the people. And he does believe that Americans would be willing to pay more taxes in order to get rid of some of the inequities that exist in the current system. I would suggest to you, however, that those positions do not constitute filing down the edges of capitalism. And then Kirchhoff goes on and says, after he lists those particular positions that Bernie Sanders is taking in his campaign, he says, and he believes it, the fact that he's drawn huge crowds, including an estimated 6,000 people in Huntington last Tuesday night, won primaries and remains in the race long after the pundits thought he would be gone, demonstrates that many share his position. In other words, he is acknowledging that Bernie Sanders' campaign has touched a chord, a sensitive chord, with many people, predominantly young people. He says, and I kind of agree with him here, Bernie has a kind of curmudgeon charisma that's played well in this particular election cycle. At a time when we suspect many politicians are lying whenever their lips are moving, Sanders exudes an earnestness that suggests, quote, even if he's wrong about everything, he seems like a pretty decent guy, unquote. So up until now, with the exception of the filing down the edges of capitalism, this is a very mild, a very soft criticism of Bernie Sanders, and I don't really have a problem with it, with that one exception. He's taking clearly positions that are opposed to the positions being taken by Bernie Sanders. But on the other hand, he's not going at Sanders with a meat cleaver either. And then he says the following. Beyond the sincerity, however, loom his quixotic socialist dreams. And this is where the trouble starts. Bernie's quixotic socialist dreams. The message right there is that Bernie is a socialist. Bernie acknowledges that he calls himself a democratic socialist. Obviously, Hoppy Kercheval has chosen to leave out the democratic part, but to focus on the socialist part. And then for evidence Kercheval goes to Richard Rubin, who covers tax policy for the Wall Street Journal. Couple of things here. The Wall Street Journal. Again, I don't have any problem with evidence as evidence. I don't have any problem with the reputation or the reputable reputation of the Wall Street Journal. But the fact of the matter is the Wall Street Journal is a notorious critic of progressive positions. That doesn't mean that it's not worth reading. It doesn't mean that the people who write for it are not to be respected. And I don't have any reason to doubt the reputation or the credibility of Richard Rubin, who covers tax policy for the Wall Street Journal. But I do claim at least the same right that conservatives take. How many times have you heard critics, conservative critics, criticize a particular position because it appeared in the New York Times? And their position oftentimes is, if it's in the New York Times, you can't believe it. I'm unwilling to go that far. I'm not going to say that if it's in the Wall Street Journal, you can't believe it. If it's evidence, you have to believe it. But I am expecting that if you go to the Wall Street Journal for evidence to use against Bernie Sanders, then you ought to be able to go to the New York Times for evidence against Ted Cruz or Donald Trump. Obviously, what we're talking about here is it's not the publication that's the issue. It's what they do with evidence. Whether they respect it or whether they feel the right to manipulate it in order to make their ideological point. Richard Rubin, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, quoted a report from the Tax Policy Center which said, quote, Mr. Sanders' proposals would increase federal taxes by $15.3 trillion over the next decade, unquote. In other words, it is the position of Richard Rubin, the position of the Tax Policy Center, that Bernie Sanders' economic programs would increase government spending, would increase taxes by $15.3 trillion over the next decade. More specifically, and I realize that we've only got 3 minutes left, so let me make this last point, and then we'll close for the day. The highest income earners, Rubin says, would see their tax rates nearly double to 63.7%, while the middle 20% of households would on average pay another $4,692 in income taxes and thereby lose 8.5% of their after-tax income. The Sanders campaign denies these numbers. I'm not going to necessarily deny them, but I am going to question them. But we don't have time to do that today. So I knew that we wouldn't finish this today, but I think it's an important issue, and I think we need to deal with it. I guess what we can say is that more than anything else, what we're engaged in here is analysis of a critical piece that goes beyond, I believe, fairness. It is driven more by ideology than by evidence. It's dangerous. And it disappoints me because of who wrote it. But we'll continue that tomorrow. We are at the end of our program today. It's 59 minutes after the hour. So I'd like to thank you for tuning in today to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Invite you back tomorrow, reminding you that our program will begin 1/2 hour later tomorrow than it did today. This is Bill O'Brien. There's some wild weather in the country today, so please be careful, be safe, take care of yourself so that you can join us again here at the Virtual Center. For Bob Kincaid and the folks at the Hit On Radio Network, thank you. Have a good day, a safe day, and be kind to each other. Thank you.